All right, well, welcome everyone to our first installment of our two-part deep dive series on public humanities training and higher education. Thanks everyone for joining us on this Wednesday afternoon. I'm based in DC here and we're watching the smog roll in this afternoon. So I hope wherever you all are, it is clear. So a note on today's conversation, we'll be recording this conversation so you'll have access to the event shortly after. My name is Michelle May-Curry and I lead the National Humanities Alliance's Humanities for All initiative, which documents and supports publicly engaged humanities scholarship across higher ed. And I'm very pleased to be joined today by Roopika Risam, who is Associate Professor of Film and Media Studies at Dartmouth College. Our conversation today builds on Humanities for All's recent report here that documents existing approaches to training in the public humanities. And we'll drop a link in the chat. It includes efforts to build a range of infrastructure. So undergraduate majors, graduate masters and certificate programs, internships, support for faculty in the forms of grants and teaching workshops. So it's fairly comprehensive across the different types of credentials and workshops and skill building spaces that exist across higher ed. And as many of you know, in the higher ed humanities community, and you may have seen over the last several years, these infrastructures have been steadily increasing across higher ed and particularly across the R1, the Research 1 landscape, which much of this report captures that landscape. But as many of you also know, this landscape, of course, is incredibly unequal and extends in turn to what work is discoverable and celebrated as good scholarship. It extends to what is funded by major philanthropic organizations. It extends to what's deemed rigorous and what's deemed service or good for tenure and review or promotion. And it's particularly visible when we talk about the latest humanities pedagogical trends, right? What is considered innovative or in vogue in the humanities classroom. And public humanities training infrastructure has been heralded as the front line of this innovation in the humanities in the last several years, for better or for worse, right? As departments build on these new training programs to recruit and retain students. And the question, as I've led Humanities for All for several years now, is how or whether our current public humanities scholarly infrastructure landscape builds on a longer history of public humanities work in higher ed, right? What is that history? What is the work that's not been described as such that is doing this work? What are the commitments of people who are doing this work for many decades? Who are the people who have been doing this work for many decades? And this is why I'm particularly excited to be talking today with Dr. Risam, whose current book project, Insurgent Academics, accounts for this sort of long history of the public humanities. So before I turn it over to her to describe some of this work, I just wanted to give you all a brief overview of some of the work that she's done and how embedded she is in these conversations. So alongside Dr. Risam's appointment in film and media studies at Dartmouth, she is also part of the digital humanities and social engagement cluster there. She was formerly chair of secondary and higher education and associate professor of education and English at Salem State University, where she also served as a faculty fellow in their digital library initiatives program. They're co-director of the Viking OER and textbook affordability initiative, coordinator of the graduate certificate in digital studies there, as well as their combined BA and MED in higher and English education. And her work has been funded by many funders, the Mellon Foundation, the National Endowment for the Humanities, Institute for Museum and Library Sciences, Mass Humanities. And her research interests are quite broad as well, and post-colonial studies, African diaspora studies, digital humanities work, and humanities knowledge infrastructures. And I just want to thank you so much, Dr. Risam, for joining us today.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here and to also see some friends in the audience.
Yes, yeah, lots of familiar faces. Hi, everyone. And we'll have plenty of time for Q&A in the second half of the hour. And um, Roopika, I have a few questions for you that I'm hoping we can start with, but I'm wondering if you can start by sort of describing your current book project, Insurgent Academics, and how it's working to do some of this historicizing work of the current public humanities landscape.
Yeah, absolutely. So, as Michelle, you were just saying, we've seen a lot of attention in recent years to public humanities as well as community engagement in universities. And this isn't particularly surprising as we think about a public discourse that displays a sometimes stunning lack of critical thinking skills and really is reflecting a culture war kind of politics and questions the value of the humanities itself. I want to note something that Michelle alluded to in my bio, which is that even though I'm at Dartmouth, I've only been there for a year, and I spent the first 9 years of my career at Salem State University, which is a not very well-funded regional public university. So that's important and has really been influential for the work that I do, because at universities, and particularly in public higher education, we're also seeing this idea that public humanities and community engagement can be a reaction to the crisis of the humanities, to the attacks on the university, to the decline in funding of public institutions. And there's also often this sense that, if we can just prove the value of the humanities by talking about what we do for communities, that it might be a way to ward against these attacks in public discourse, and also defunding and criticism from politicians and from state legislatures. And we're seeing universities that are really eager to brand themselves as, the engaged university, or to turn to this idea of engagement into a brand in response to these strains and pressures, cuts to funding and declining enrollments. So I've been listening and I've been participating in these conversations in public higher ed more than I have at an elite institution, more than I have at an R1. And as a practitioner of public humanities, of the digital form, really, mostly, and as someone who's invested in thinking about higher ed problem solving more generally, I've really been struck by this way that public humanities and community engaged research are treated as something that's new. Something that's kind of come up recently because it's a solution to these problems. Or when it's not treated as new, it's traced to scholarship on community engagement as a field, which really solidified a space for itself in research and higher education in the 1990s. So about 5 years ago, while I was at Salem State, I began working with people who located themselves in that field, both at Salem State and across other regional public universities in Massachusetts. And I was immediately struck by the way the field was so dehistoricized. And the way that my colleagues would tell it, white people invented community engagement, and they called it service learning. And that work seemed like to be a little bit colonial, a little extractive, and a little self-serving. So send students out into a community, often with little knowledge of the community, little understanding of how to interact with people in culturally sustaining kinds of ways, and go solve the community's problems. And not in doing that, recognizing that communities have expertise and they have knowledge, and that they don't need 19-year-olds to come and solve their problems. Not that there's anything wrong with 19-year-olds and they don't have good ideas, because they absolutely do. But the trend in this field of community engagement was just not super respectful and not super healthy. And listening to this, I was really sort of thinking about the inherent problem as universities are trying to brand themselves as engaged and doing more public humanities, doing more community engaged humanities, or social sciences, or even sciences, is that we can't have a situation where the university is just thinks of themselves as bringing the light of knowledge into a community, but instead really need to think about what it means to have true collaboration and multi-directional flows of knowledge. So after a few too many conversations with, in which I had to listen to this so-called history of university community partnerships, I finally said, actually, scholars of color and Indigenous scholars have been doing this kind of work for over a century. I said this to my colleagues. From the very first moment that we were allowed into universities, this is the work we were doing. Being able to infiltrate the university has been a very powerful opportunity to think about how do we borrow from it and how do we steal from it and take its resources and use that to support the growth and this sustainability of our own communities. And none of the people who are doing this work for over a century were getting rewarded for it. Certainly not in the way that there's a lot of acceptance and a lot of embrace for community engagement right now in academic institutions. And in fact, they were often punished for it too, pushed out, not promoted, because when they were doing it, it was a threat. And they were transforming the very purpose of the university, a university that did not want to be transformed away from a space of producing knowledge that's gate kept for elite people and for students with the means to attend, instead towards thinking about what broader audiences look like. So it's kind of ironic that now everybody's super on board with it. And yet for so many decades and more than a century, scholars of color, Indigenous scholars were just doing this as a part of their academic lives and their lives as members of their community. So I'm really grateful that my community engaged colleagues listened. When I said this, I was a little bit worried that they would be like, no, there's a whole field. It's research. That was not real. But we've now had a really long and pleasant working relationship as founders of the New England Equity and Engagement Consortium, which is originally started, it used to be the Massachusetts Equity Engagement Consortium, and then I had to go move to an institution in New Hampshire, so we had to change the name. But we've been doing a lot of different projects that aim to push public humanities and community engaged work in universities more broadly away from the kind of colonial white saviorist charity mindset that's been so part of it when it's talked about as a real thing, as opposed to all the people who've been doing it for more than a century, when it was sort of like, why are you doing these things? This is not research. This is not real. The New England Equity and Engagement Consortium works very closely with Campus Compact, a national organization that promotes civic engagement on college campuses. We have also an edited volume coming out in August called Anti-Racist Community Engagement, which is chock full of case studies that illuminate some principles that we designed through a previous project for what anti-racist community engagement looks like, which we developed in collaboration with students of color and Indigenous students and with community partners themselves. So now, instead of assuming that their audience is people who situate themselves in community engagement as an academic field, my colleagues are always pointing beyond that and speaking to this century plus of people of color, Indigenous people who've been doing this work for so long. But there really hasn't been an attempt to tell this story and to really articulate who are these people and what were they doing. So Insurgent Academics, which is the book that I'm trying to finish, is beginning to tell this story. And I'm saying beginning because I don't want to own this story. I want this to be to instigate other people to explore other voices, other perspectives that don't get represented in the book when it comes out. So when I first conceived of it, I really just imagined it being an account of public humanities. But as I revise it, particularly in light of the experience I've had with the New England Equity and Engagement Consortium and seeing what's happening with this idea of engagement being picked up as a branding kind of concept for universities, I've actually expanded it to really being an account of the engaged university. So it does include still, and actually I would say strongly focused on public humanities, but I also do bring in public social sciences and public other forms of public science as well. And so my goal is really to offer is to start creating a legible scholarly tradition for public humanities and for interdisciplinary forms of community engagement. So in the book, I'm blending theoretical insights with stories from scholars from the 19th century on, whose work has really transformed universities and communities. And I call this academic insurgency, which I describe as a mode of scholarly praxis or way of being in the academy that really takes the substance of academic work, so scholarship and teaching and service, and orients it towards multiple publics and towards community engagement and different forms of activism and partnership and collaboration. And the term insurgency is really important for me because it really captures what I feel like has been radical and transformative about the work that some of these figures have done for so long. So throughout the book, I sort of unveil different aspects of what academic insurgency is. And first off, it is interdisciplinary. It's sort of necessarily interdisciplinary, but really interdisciplinary, not the way our universities pay service to interdisciplinarity and then punish you for not doing work in disciplinary ways. So it's a different take on interdisciplinarity. Academic insurgency also implies a collaboration and a collaborative viewpoint engaged in forms of research that are specifically aimed at working not on or for, but with communities. Really also foregrounding the expertise and knowledge within the communities. So critical to this idea of academic insurgency is a fundamentally non-extractive relationship to communities that promotes multi-directional knowledge. I'm sure we can all think of many examples that have happened on our campuses in which, somebody, a researcher, an entity from the university swoops into an underserved community, extracts their data, does a project, goes back, goes away, never talks to them again, benefits professionally off of having done that work without have had a longstanding commitment. And that's this kind of extractive form that I'm sort of saying, look, we can look to this wonderful example of work that's been going on that wasn't like that, and it doesn't have to be like that. Academic insurgency also includes the use of multiple modes of communication, multiple genres of writing to bridge multiple audiences. So not just monographs and journal articles, but thinking about, what the more expansive nature of what scholarly communication looks like, which could be, different kinds of journals that are open to and even invite in writing from the public, data sets. Today, we might think of blogs and op-eds and multimodal writing and digital exhibits and digital archives and community archives as some of the ideas. So those are some of the ideas that I've been playing with and trying to tease out throughout the book.
Thank you so much for that overview. And I'm so excited for this book to be published. And I'm also just really excited to hear about the consortial work that you're doing. I've been really excited about institutional consortiums as a mode of doing this type of work. And I hope that we have time at some point in this conversation to talk about consortial work as a really progressive form of doing this work. But maybe one of the ways that we could dig into some of the examples in your book is whether there are projects that you can identify from this long history that we might consider now as doing public humanities work, but at the time went by a different name, or that, insurgency is actually the right term for what they're doing in that way.
Yeah, absolutely. So my quintessential insurgent academic is W.B. Du Bois, who actually wrote my dissertation on. And then I decided nobody needed another book about Du Bois, certainly not written by me. So I do other things with the knowledge that I have from that. But for me, I write about Du Bois as really just preeminent insurgent intellectual. Unlike so much of the discourse in community engaged work today that sort of talks about taking knowledge out into the community, Du Bois knew that being a steward or a custodian of knowledge wasn't something that only academics could do. He knew that it was important to really try and make the walls and the gates of our universities porous, and to allow for those multi-directional exchanges of knowledge and expertise. So, I mean, eventually Du Bois is interesting because he sort of left university life. He came back to university life at various points in his life, but while he was still working in a university, he was experimenting with scholarly communications in ways that are really progressive and really great examples and models for us. He was really thinking about how to engage multiple audiences, how to showcase the expertise and knowledge within Black communities beyond the academy. And of course, he's really well known after 1910 for doing this with The Crisis as an editor, but I want to point out that he was doing that before that and really understood that being able to own the means of production of knowledge was really, really powerful, right down to buying a printing plant, which he did. So Du Bois co-founded the Moon Illustrated Weekly, which you can see here. It came out in, this is not the first version. This is number 14. So this one's from 1906, but he founded it in 1905. And it was founded to, in his words, promote self-knowledge within the race. So he was really creating a space for people outside the academy to be able to write about their experiences and write about what they know and to share that with other people. He would go on later to do a monthly called The Horizon, a journal of the color line, which would run from 1907 to 1910, which also shared original writing on African-American life. And so that's sort of one key example for me, is like doing that. And so he is sort of the person who helped me crystallize an idea for this book, in a sense, because I was able to be like, okay, who do I know who actually was doing this work well before the current moment? And Du Bois, for me, was one of those people. Another important moment also is around the emergence of ethnic studies in universities in the US. So, when we look to the work of campus activists, particularly many of them were in California, in the late 1960s and the early 1970s, who were trying to create ethnic studies programs, that they weren't just trying to create academic programs. They were very much thinking about the embeddedness of the work that they were doing in the communities that they came from. So that's part of their work. It wasn't just about institutionalizing an interdiscipline. It was really about expanding the walls of the academy. So this is, here's one example actually of, turns out, a project funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities in 1973. And I went and I looked them up in the grants database to like double check. And indeed, they received $41,000 in 1973 for this project, Black Studies, Chicano Studies Oral History Project, which was actually going out and doing oral histories with community members in Black and Chicano communities and trying to preserve them because they were worried that their stories would eventually be lost. And so, this is clearly, a collection that's still being maintained by Claremont Graduate Center, which got the grant originally in 1973. And so that's another really great example, just to remember, all these, we're talking now about digital humanities and digital archives and community archives and archiving stories of people whose voices haven't been told. And here we had the sort of earliest moments of ethnic studies that was very much a part of the work and a part of the discourse.
That's a great starting point for us to think about when we're rehistoricizing. And I'm sure your book is going to have so many similar examples across disciplines for us to dig into. And so to bring this history into sort of closer conversation with the conversation around public humanities program building and degree credentials, I wanted to pause here and give some space to some of the insights from our recent report on public humanities training. And again, we dropped the link in the chat at the beginning of the session, but maybe we can drop it again so that for folks who are just entering. Awesome, thanks, Inger. And to bring these two moments into conversation, I I've been thinking a lot about what the overarching goals of building these training programs in the current moment are, right? What's the purpose of building out a master's program or a internship program or a certificate program as a cohort building model, right? As opposed to, you know, embedding some of this work in existing disciplines. What does it mean to call it public humanities as such, right? And sort of separate it out in that way. And the report that we published in January identifies 4 goals, and I'll go over them now, and then maybe we can start to put this history in conversation with this current moment a little bit. And so the first goal that we identify is offering students the opportunity to act on civic and social justice commitments through the humanities, right? So the moment that we're living in now, our students really want to engage with the world in their coursework. They want their classrooms to be sites of engagement. And so students are coming to the faculty saying, how can we help? How can we sort of do this work now? And so we're seeing that in sort of the creation of coursework that is specifically deemed public humanities work. Then we also see a goal of training current and future faculty in methods and public humanities methods to shape the future of humanities disciplines in the academy. Right, we're talking about this current moment of this current sort of embattled moment of the humanities, right? And thinking about how faculty are being trained for a future that is changing, and humanities disciplines that are changing, right? So we're seeing less humanities faculty positions opening, but more faculty positions opening that are specifically asking for students to have public humanities training to do that work. Then there's a goal of sort of addressing the challenges that faculty confront in developing a publicly engaged practice and teaching about the public humanities. We have to acknowledge that retooling existing coursework takes time, right? It often takes money. Faculty need retraining and new skills. They need guidelines for assessing things like tenure and promotion, guidelines for sort of what they're teaching their students across the department. And then we're also looking at students who want tools and experiences that may help them succeed beyond higher ed career pathways. So students are looking for professionalization experience. And this is when I start to think about professionalization as an effect of doing this work and not a reason for doing this work, right? If you have students coming into the classroom saying, I want a job, a humanities job, and they're coming to the public humanities looking for a job, right? We're losing the reason why. The reason why has changed. And so I'm sort of locating these current efforts to build up public humanities degree credentials for undergraduates and graduate students. Roopika, I'm wondering if we can sort of talk about how you're understanding this current moment in relationship to this history of insurgent academics.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I think very much the idea of academic insurgency is connected to preparing the next generations. And so I very much see the work that we're doing with students as part of that. So even when I'm asked to consult sort of as an individual on public humanities projects, I try to find ways to bring students into it. I've actually just in the process of working on a really wonderful project with a social services organization in Gloucester, Massachusetts, who owned this house, and they, at one point, the old owners, who were a white family, handed them a packet of photos, and they were photos of a Black family. And they said, okay, like, as far as we know, this was the family that once owned this house. And so the organization Wellspring was sort of curious about the history of the house, and there's a lot of lore in the city of Gloucester about this house, and really awful stories about, a kind enslaver freed his enslaved person and gave him this house. And like, this is a very Massachusetts thing to try to say, by the way. And the people at the organization were feeling like, we're not sure we're super comfortable with this story, and we want to really know what happened. And so they came to me and said, will you work with us on this project? We're trying to do the house history. And I said, yes, but I need to bring Matthew Swindell, Salem State graduate student. I wasn't even working at Salem State anymore, but I was like, I need Matthew Swindell to come join us. He's a master's student, really wonderful, loves North Shore history. This is going to be absolutely wonderful. And, we absolutely could not have done our project if not for this particular student, who's going to have a wonderful career in the cultural heritage industry in the region. I have absolutely no doubt. And so we did lots of research, and we traced the family tree, and, we met, got in touch with family members, and we put together an exhibit that's now a permanent exhibit in the house. You can see a picture of it here from the Boston Globe story on it. And it was just a really, really, really wonderful experience to get to bring a student into that and really, have them, be an expert and be part of the work, and such a great person to work with. I think the other thing, though, that I think is key to this kind of insurgent stance is that it's important to not overlook that we're not just talking about faculty. We're also talking about librarians. We're also talking about staff members and technologists, and they're part of this work, and they have needs too. The amount of labor, I feel like, you've alluded to the amount of labor that this kind of work in public humanities can require of faculty, but it really also can require a lot of work from staff members, technologists, and librarians, and other people working in universities as well. But unfortunately, right now, the labor and funding and reward structures of higher ed grossly de-incentivize participation in this kind of work. So the people who take it on out of kindness and generosity, but they're working double, they're working triple. Sometimes they're not being compensated. Some universities don't let librarians or staff members get paid extra for extra work on projects like this, and that absolutely has to change. Of course, tenure and promotion guidelines often fail to reward this work, and certainly this applies as well to librarians who are tenure track librarians, which is it certainly was the case at Salem State University where I worked, and so that also needs to change. I've really been involved in a number of initiatives to try and address this. I feel like I find myself gravitating towards these kind of more larger structural issues as things that I want to address through my research, more so than, I want to tell a particular story, which I enjoy doing. I love that project with Wellspring House in Gloucester. It was great. But I also like to think about problem solving at a bigger level. So I am the principal investigator of the Digital Ethnic Futures Consortium, which received a $3 million grant from the Mellon Foundation. And so we basically give out money to support faculty and librarians and staff members who are doing digital public humanities. The community engagement piece is part of this work because it's specifically for people at regional comprehensive universities, and regional comprehensive universities have a very strong mission of being stewards of place and having a lot of expertise and knowledge on community engagement. So we wanted to, I was at one at the time. And so we were like, this is what we want to support. And Mellon got on board. So we have 3 large subawards to 3 regional universities other than Salem State. We also have smaller grants for course development and institutional capacity building, like professional development at other colleges and universities. And then we provide mentoring by hiring digital humanists with public humanities experience and having them work with the people that we give out our fellowships to. And so it's been a really successful model. I mean, directly through our fellowship programs, from the from like the mothership, like from DEF CON itself, DEF CON is what we call it. We've served over 100 people directly with fellowships. We also, on each campus, there have also been additional people each year who get fellowships and get support for developing projects and developing coursework. Our community on our email list is over 300 people strong, and they come to our speaker series events. They come to our virtual annual meeting. Jim McGrath, who's here, who's also a colleague of mine in Salem State, actually did a wonderful workshop for a wonderful speaker event for DEF CON. And right now we're hoping that Mellon will give us more money when we finish out are trying to build up regional consortiums for collaboration among regional public universities. So that's sort of one of the initiatives. I've also been involved in tenure and promotion guidelines in many ways. One is the Journal of Reviews in Digital Humanities, which I co-founded with Jennifer Giuliano, and we co-founded it in 2020. We get a lot of digital public humanities projects, particularly ones that are undertaken with students. And what we do is we have people who've done projects write overviews that we send out along with the digital projects to reviewers who write a review, almost like, so I have to think about it like a book review kind of the project. And so we have no delusions that this is going to solve the problem of tenure and promotion, but at least because we are peer reviewing it, it takes away the ability for somebody to say, but that's not peer reviewed, so it's not scholarship. So there's still a long way to go, but we like the fact that we've at least taken out that argument against the scholarly value of the work and a desire to kind of slot it just into teaching or just into service, which, by the way, I mean, the attitude that those are somehow lesser is also problematic as well. At Salem State, we managed to change our tenure and promotion guidelines to include community engaged research specifically. And then we undertook institutional and cross-institutional professional development with peer evaluators and chairs and deans and provosts to teach them how to actually operationalize these new guidelines, because we found out if you build it, they will not come. You have to actually go to them and change their minds. And then and probably because of all this work I was doing, I was asked by the Modern Language Association to be on an ad hoc committee that drafted guidelines for evaluating publicly engaged humanities scholarship. And so we wrote, our report came out in the fall. And it's so funny because I think people were sort of expecting us to say like an op-ed is 5 points and community engaged digital project is 17 points or something like that. But really, we came out with what I feel like is a very strong ethical statement about what this work is and how to evaluate it, which is slightly different, but really, really important. So it's, in my view, it's really a sort of, I would say, insurgent, multi-pronged approach that's necessary. And what I love about the work that you're doing, Michelle, with your organization, is that you are seeing it as a multi-pronged approach as well, not just to build the programs for students, but really attacking the ways that the structures of higher ed are making this work challenging at the very moment when it's so critical to the mission of universities and to what our students are demanding from us. So in the end, for me, it's really about equity. It's about trying to make sure that we're not continuing that trend where the scholars of Indigenous studies and in other ethnic studies fields are being penalized or having to do disproportionately more work, or that our librarian colleagues, our staff colleagues aren't having to do that too. It's time that changes. And people always say to me, like, how do you change this? And I'm like, you literally just go do it. Like, you go get the tools you need to advocate to your colleagues, to your administration, and change their minds and make that your responsibility, because there's no magic answer. We can't sit here waiting for Harvard to decide to do it, because they're probably not. So, we have to do it ourselves.
Mm-hmm. I'm just snapping along off screen right now. And okay, I have a comment and a question, and then I want to turn it over to Q&A. So, and as I'm talking, as we're going through this last question, please, folks in the audience, feel free to start populating the chat with questions or raising your hand so that you can unmute and ask your question. But as you were talking, I was thinking two things. One, again, I'm hearing another consortial project, right? This like regional model is just I'm just so excited to see that work happening, because it really harnesses the value of place. But two, I was thinking back to you historicizing the rise of ethnic studies departments and programs as a specifically public humanities oriented moment, and comparing it in my mind to like how public humanities majors and minors are currently getting created, right? How sort of institutional that work has been, and happening around, departmental meetings or conversations with deans or through grant line channels, right? In comparison to a history of creating ethnic studies departments or AFAM studies departments where folks are protesting, right? They're doing sit-ins, right? It's a deeply insurgent effort to push through these programs. And I'm just marking that difference in how we're moving in this moment. And my last question, and you're already starting to do some of this work by pointing us to all these different things that you've been able to touch recently. But who are some other people that we should be watching who are doing insurgent academic work right now? What are some projects that you're looking to right now that you would put firmly within this tradition of insurgency?
Yeah, I mean, I think, for example, the work coming out of the Recovery Project at the University of Houston and Arte Publico Press, they run U.S. Latino Digital Humanities Initiative. The press itself has existed for quite a long time. The people who are there have been doing digital humanities for quite a long time. It's only in recent few years that that work has been recognized as digital humanities. And so, I mean, they are really key folks who understand community work and what it means to think about community archives and post-custodial archiving and kind of who owns and who's responsible for the cultural heritage of communities that have been minoritized and that, don't trust universities for very good reasons. So I think that's a really important project. One thing I just want to say that I think that there are ways that our colleagues are being insurgent academics every day, particularly in states where they are dealing with anti-DEI legislation, anti-critical race theory legislation, anti-LGBTQ legislation, where just going into the classroom is an insurgent act. Where still saying what you need to say and teaching what you need to teach is an act of public humanities. Even if it's happening in a classroom. And I think we can't really extricate that also from the funding issues in higher ed. I just saw yesterday, I think it was, that in Florida, Ron DeSantis vetoed $120 million for public higher education, which is just absolutely horrifying. And when you combine that with all this legislation, it's an even more chilling effect, particularly for our colleagues who are contingent faculty members who, already are sort of vulnerable to having their positions eliminated very easily. And this sort of makes it, even more challenging. And yet they are still going to their classroom and they are still teaching. And, they're leaders and they're examples. So I think looking to and thinking about how do we work with organizations that are trying to organize for changes in academic labor, like New Faculty Majority. That's really important organization doing good work. And then I also think there's a role for unions to play. I was unionized at Salem State when I was there. I'm not unionized right now. But I think there's a lot of potential ways that unions can be really supportive of changing those structures of higher ed to make this public humanities work possible.
So we have some time for Q&A. We have about 15 minutes left in our hour. And so I'm going to turn it over to you all if you have questions for either of us. I have lots more questions. So I think yes. Sure.
I'll jump in if it's okay. So I've been doing this kind of work since 2004, 2005 in Spanish department, teaching what was called, service learning back then. And so for me, the terms perhaps matter less than just that underlying ethics of being mutually beneficial, meeting community identified needs, those kinds of things that I heard the speaker talk about in how she is defining this movement right now. And for me, those things have always been there, but obviously not for everyone. One of the challenges that I see is the socialization of students into this work within the limits of a semester-long project. And so when you, Michelle, talked about, student professionalization and putting, sort of, and the speaker spoke about putting students into communities they don't know very much about already. That's a lot of upfront work that has to take place. And when your colleagues are not also involved in projects like this, or if you're not part of a consortium, or if your students just happen to fall into your classroom without a real passion or background behind them, there's a lot of catch-up work to do there. So I wondered if there are any thoughts about that sort of, just this sort of popcorn effect that can take place with public humanities across a certain campus.
Yeah, I think that's a really important question. One of the things that we've been through our work with DEF CON with our colleagues at other institutions is really have them thinking about how do you look around you to find the other people to try and find the critical mass, because often what happens, and this is particularly the case at universities that don't really have the funds to have a center for community engagement, a center for civic engagement, a center for service learning, whatever they want to call it, is that there are people who are often doing that work, but they're doing it alone. And I learned a lot about that from digital humanities, because when I came to Salem State, I was the digital humanist. I was not even hired for that. And I thought, you know what, I need to find the people who are at least like willing to consider this as a thing they might be interested in. And so, slowly over time, I connected with the university archivist, Susan Edwards, who was very interested in digital humanities and hadn't done any yet, but we, together were able to start building various campus infrastructures with no money, by the way. If you look at my bio, there's a very large sum of money that is my grant number, but actually most of that is from the last 3 years. So the first 7 years, we were shaking out, changing the couch cushions and finding different pre-existing programs on campus that we could repurpose for our own uses to figure out how we could bring people together. So one example that is that they had these strategic planning grants. And so, we wanted to start an undergraduate program that gave students the support to do, different kinds of projects. And so we went and we wrote a grant proposal to our institution, sort of retroactively fitting in what we did to the institutional priorities. And we got the money on the second try. We saw that there was a structure for faculty learning communities that was already well known and well trusted at the institution and always regularly funded. So we said, hey, can we have one? And we're going to do it on our topic. And so, it takes having people who are willing to do that work to try and bring the critical mass together. And I'm not going to lie and say that this happens overnight, but if you can bring those people together and start having the conversations, eventually what you're doing becomes more legible to the institution and you end up with more leverage to actually try and make the case for support and funding. Often the biggest mistake that people do is just assume that there's never going to be support and funding. But the problem is if you are assuming that, then you're never able to amass the data that you need to make the case for its impact on students, its impact in the world that actually could help you get the support that you want.
Edney.
Sorry, it's Edna, but you pronounced it correctly according to the phonetics, so no worries. I don't know how to frame this as a question, but I think it's just an expression of gratitude to you, Roopika, for persisting and insisting on public humanities as someone who has a PhD in American Studies from a program that really promoted digital humanities early on, but was so caught up in the pressures of institutionalization and professionalization. I actually made a choice several years into my academic career to refuse to pursue tenure in order to not lose a sense of connection to that thing that really compelled me into my field, which was the notion of doing the work of humanities as, I wasn't thinking about it in terms of public intellectual at the time, but I was in grad school back in the 90s, so a long time ago, but also as a scholar in the field of women's, gender, and queer studies, who has studied the history of field formation, both for women's studies, queer studies, ethnic studies, and American studies. the pressures of institutionalization have really caused a lot of the departments. I work primarily as an itinerant professor. I'm at Cal Poly San Luis Obispo right now. It's like I've been here the longest I've been anywhere. It's weird. But the departments that I've worked for are so institutionally cowed that what you just said about really needing to convince people that there are ways to pursue public humanities projects within the institution as possible feels like an absolute impossibility. And as a precariously hired part-time lecturer with no status in a department that has no status, every time I propose something to my colleagues, whether it's in my department, that my main department or other departments I teach in, or even in the library, everyone's just like, yep, nope, it won't get any support at this school. And I'm at the point where I'm so discouraged. So I want to just thank you for reminding me that I don't have to stay in that space of discouragement. So, and I usually pursue the outlet through working with students. So this is, I accidentally ended up here today, and I'm so glad I did. Thank you.
You're welcome. And because
All of you.
yours is a state school, right? Cal Poly?
Yeah, it's a state school that really pushes notions of STEM education. It really is proud of itself for being a polytechnic, and it loves to promote entrepreneurship. But it is also an institution that its motto is learn by doing. So it's like, it ought to be supportive of these kinds of projects. It's oddly not. Anyway, I'll shut up now.
Apply for one of our fellowships in October or next year, please, at DEF CON.
Michael, you have a question.
Thanks. So I teach at a small rural regional institution in Southwest Georgia. And my institution is reasonably supportive of public humanities initiatives. The problem is that we have a very divided community with a long history of segregation, and communities with very, very different narratives. So do you have any kind of, this might be too big a question for a short session like this, but do you have any practical advice for building the kinds of relationships in a community like this that would get people to trust you and to talk to you?
Yeah, it takes time. I mean, it really does. And I think that's the other, that's the other challenge here is that, it takes time, and it also helps if you have, you sort of work through your network of connections to find relationships with people. Cold calling is probably never a wildly successful thing. I feel like most of the work that all of the public humanities work I've done has been like somebody knows me, or somebody knows somebody who knows me. Or, somebody's looking for someone who can, run the reading group for the retired folks at the library, and they're like, oh, you should meet Roopsie. And apparently this is my ministry. No, but that's, so I think it's like, think about how can you trace your networks to the networks in the community with the kinds of organizations you care about. And I mean, the thing about small towns is that actually can be easier in a small town than in a bigger city.
Other questions from the audience? I have another question.
Oh, can I just say that Jim made a really good comment in the chat, just for people should read, just about having concerns about institutions and grants and tenured profs taking up a lot of resources. When Edna was talking about her career path, I was thinking about how I went to work at Salem State intentionally because I was told you can do whatever you want as long as you don't ask anybody for money. And I thought, this is where I could be the scholar that I want to be and do whatever I want and not have to worry about what my colleagues expect me to be. And so Dartmouth came to recruit me in 2016. And I said, no, thank you. I'm going to be here. I still have work to do here. I want to keep doing the work and growing as the person I want to be here. And it was actually only after I got tenure and I felt like I was tenurable there that they came back and were like, all right, are you ready now? And I said, actually, now I am. because I felt like I was in a position where I could actually take advantage of their resources and try to figure out how to direct them elsewhere. And so, there are things that we don't have in our Mellon grant that we need to fund that I am able to, through the access to resources that I have at Dartmouth, to be able to like form partnerships and actually get some of that work going. And I think more people need to be thinking like that, thinking about if you are at an elite institution, that you have a responsibility to think about how do you redistribute the wealth, and also to do it in a way that doesn't mean that just because you're writing the check, you have any more outsized influence or power or anything in the relationship.
Yeah, I have a question that that dovetails beautifully off of what you're saying. Just generally the influx of funding into public humanities from major philanthropic organizations has been quite visible over the last decade, and it's really contributed to the creation of many of these programs, and we're seeing also the exit of a lot of that funding right now, and the effect that exit is having, the ending of programs, the archiving of digital humanities projects, etc. And I'm just curious if you have any blueprints from this history that you're pulling out of folks who really just were working outside of funding structures, or perhaps knew how to sustain their work beyond that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, the answer is sort of yes and no, because, certain things Du Bois did, lasted, are still in existence, and some lasted for like a year or two, right? Which is okay. I mean, and that's fine too. The Insurgent Academics of Higher Ed's past were not being handed millions of dollars from the Mellon Foundation. So we know that they were onto something. And really, it seemed like what they were doing was doing what they could with what they had. And so their inspiration was really influential for me on the work we did at Salem State, because as I said, we didn't have a lot of money, and we were looking for change in couch cushions. And that was what we were using to try and build the programs that we had for students. And so this actually had a lot of influence on the work that Alex Heel and I did in our special issue on minimal computing, which is digital humanities specific, but the concept is actually highly relevant to public humanities. And so I won't bore you with what minimal computing itself is, but I will tell you that it's about different kinds of work that we do under constraints, and they could be financial constraints or labor constraints, or even like technical knowledge. And we were able to really distill a decision-making process or a heuristic for how to work under those constraints into 4 questions. What do you have? What do you need? What must you prioritize? And what are you willing to give up? Because too often people are waiting till they get the grant to actually do the work. And on the one hand, if you actually do something, even at a small scale, you're probably more likely to get the grant, but also you're probably not going to get the grant anyway. And so if you really want to do the work, you can do it at a small scale with what you have available to you. As long as you're willing to put together, partnerships and relationships and collaborations with people who aren't trying to do it all on your own, which shouldn't be doing anyway, because it's public humanities. So for me, it's very much about, don't wait. And it's okay if what you're doing is small scale. I mean, almost everything I've done has been small scale, realistically. I mean, now with these consortial things, I feel like I'm moving into a phase of my career where I seem to be getting embroiled in these bigger things. But for most of the time, it wasn't that. It was sort of, all right, I found $1,000. I'm going to go to the high school and say like, hey, do you want to do a project with your students? And like, what would help you and what would help your students? And like, let's go do it, So just don't wait, because, the grant funders, we can't be beholden to what they feel like is their priority at any given moment.
We have reached the end of our hour together. I just want to thank you so much for your time, Dr. Risam, and to you all for your attention this afternoon. This has been recorded, so it will live on our website shortly, and I will send out an email to let you all know. But thank you so much. Please be in touch if you have further questions, and take care.
Thank you so much, everybody. Good to see you.